On April 27, 1865, the steamboat Sultana exploded on the Mississippi River near Memphis, Tennessee. The boat was carrying over 2,400 people, most of them Union soldiers recently released from Confederate prisoner of war camps, finally heading home after the Civil War had ended. The boilers exploded in the middle of the night, and the boat burned and sank. An estimated 1,800 people died more than perished on the Titanic. Yet today, most Americans have never heard of the Sultana. This is the story of America's worst maritime disaster, a tragedy of greed, corruption, and timing that history forgot. To understand the Sultana disaster, we need to understand the context of April 1865, and the Civil War had just ended. Robert E. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox on April 9th. The Union had won. Across the South, Confederate prison camps were releasing thousands of Union soldiers who had been held as prisoners of war. These men had survived horrific conditions. Many had been held at Andersonville and Cahaba, notorious Confederate prison camps where disease, starvation, and overcrowding had killed thousands. The survivors were emaciated, sick, and desperate to get home to their families in the North. The U.S. government had arranged for steamboats to transport these freed prisoners up the Mississippi River from Vicksburg, Mississippi to Cairo, Illinois, where they would catch trains home. The soldiers would finally be reunited with their families after months or years of war and imprisonment. The Sultana was a side-wheel paddle steamer built in 1863. It was designed to carry both passengers and cargo on the Mississippi River. The boat was 260 feet long and had a legal capacity of 376 passengers, though, like most riverboats of the era, it often carried more. The Sultana was powered by 4 tubular boilers that generated steam to turn the massive paddle wheels. These boilers were the heart of the ship, but also its most dangerous component. Steamboat boiler explosions were common in the mid-1800s. Poor maintenance, excessive pressure, and faulty construction led to frequent catastrophic failures. In April 1865, the Sultana was making routine runs between New Orleans and St. Louis. On April 21st, while stopped in Vicksburg, the crew discovered that one of the boilers had a bulge and a leak, signs of dangerous weakness. The proper repair would have required removing the boiler and replacing damaged sections, a job that would take days. But the boat's captain, J. Cass Mason, was in a hurry, and he was about to make a deal that would kill over 1,800 people. The Army needed to transport thousands of recently freed prisoners of war up the Mississippi. There were several steamboats available in Vicksburg, but the Army quartermaster, Captain Reuben Hatch, had a plan to make money from the situation. Hatch was corrupt. He had been court-martialed earlier in the war for corruption, but had been reinstated. Now he saw an opportunity for profit. The government paid steamboat owners $5 per enlisted man and $10 per officer transported. If he could get all the soldiers onto a single boat, the captain of that boat would make a fortune. And Hatch expected a kickback. Hatch and Captain Mason made a deal. Mason would take all the prisoners, as many as possible, on a single trip. In exchange, Mason would pay Hatch a bribe. The exact amount has been lost to history, but the arrangement was clear. Overcrowding would mean profit for both men. The proper repair to the Sultana's boiler would have taken days, and Mason didn't want to lose the lucrative contract. So instead of doing it right, he had a patch job done. A small piece of metal was riveted over the leak, a repair that might hold for a short time, but was nowhere near safe for a heavily loaded boat. On April 24th, 1865, the loading began. Union soldiers who had survived the war and Confederate prison camps lined up to board the Sultana. They were excited, jubilant even. They were going home. The war was over. They had survived. Their ordeal was almost over. But there were far too many of them for one boat. The Sultana's legal capacity was 376 passengers. Safety considerations suggested it could handle perhaps 600. 700 in an emergency, but over the next few hours, more than 2,400 people were packed onto the boat. The exact number has never been definitively determined because passenger lists were poorly kept or destroyed, but estimates range from 2,400 to 2,500 people. Approximately 1,960 recently released Union prisoners of war, about 22 guards, 70 paying civilian passengers, 85 crew members. The boat was dangerously, absurdly overcrowded. Men were packed onto every deck, crammed into every available space. Some were sitting on the paddle wheel housings. Others were on the roof. The deck was so crowded people could barely move. The boat sat low in the water, weighed down by the massive human cargo. The wooden deck timbers creaked under the weight, and the boilers, already damaged and poorly repaired, would have to work at maximum capacity to move this overloaded vessel upstream against the Mississippi's current. Photographs taken before departure show the Sultana absolutely packed with humanity. Every visible surface is covered with men. It looks like a disaster waiting to happen, and it was. The Sultana departed Vicksburg on April the 24th and made slow progress up the Mississippi. The boat stopped at Memphis on April 26th to take on coal. By all accounts, the trip had been uneventful so far, though the boat was sluggish and hard to maneuver due to the extreme weight. After coaling in Memphis, the Sultana departed around 1 a.m. on April 27th, continuing north. The passengers, mostly soldiers, were sleeping wherever they could find space. It was a warm spring night. The river was high due to spring flooding with strong currents and debris. At approximately 2 a.m., about 7 miles north of Memphis near Marion, Arkansas, the weakened boilers exploded. The explosion was massive and catastrophic. All 3 of the Sultana's boilers exploded almost simultaneously, creating a blast that could be heard for miles. The explosion ripped through the center of the boat, instantly killing hundreds of soldiers sleeping near the boilers. Superheated steam scalded many more, and the blast scattered red-hot coals and debris across the wooden decks. Within seconds, the boat was on fire. The explosion had destroyed the boat's center structure, essentially breaking it in half. Men who had been sleeping on the upper decks fell into the inferno below. Those near the explosion were killed instantly by the blast or scalded to death by steam. The fire spread rapidly, feeding on the wooden structure and coal stores. Hundreds of men were thrown into the Mississippi River by the explosion. Hundreds more jumped to escape the flames, but most of these soldiers couldn't swim. Swimming wasn't a common skill in the 1860s, especially among rural farm boys who made up most of the army. The Mississippi was running high and fast due to spring flooding. The water was cold, around 55 degrees Fahrenheit. The current was strong. Debris from the flooded river trees, branches, lumber was everywhere, creating hazards. Men thrashed in the water, trying to stay afloat. Some grabbed onto pieces of wreckage. Others clung to each other, forming human chains that often pulled everyone down. Those who couldn't swim went under within minutes. Even those who could swim struggled against the cold water and strong current. Some men made it to nearby islands or the Arkansas shore, muddy, flooded, and treacherous, but solid ground. These were the lucky ones. They had survived the explosion, escaped the fire, and made it through the water to safety. But most didn't make it. They drowned in the dark, cold water of the Mississippi, often within sight of shore. Men who had survived years of war, who had endured Confederate prison camps, who were literally days away from seeing their families again, died in the river. On the burning hulk of the Sultana, those who remained faced an impossible choice: stay on the burning boat and die in the flames, or jump into the river and likely drown. Most chose the water, hoping for a miracle. The Sultana burned through the night, drifting downstream with the current, eventually sinking near Memphis. When daylight came, the full horror of the disaster became apparent. The river was full of bodies, some floating, some caught in debris, some washed up on shore. Rescue boats from Memphis and nearby vessels pulled survivors from the water, but they also recovered hundreds of corpses. The exact death toll will never be known with certainty because passenger lists were incomplete or destroyed. Official estimates range from 1,547 to 1,800 deaths, though some historians believe the number could be even higher. What we do know is that of the approximately 2,400 people on board, somewhere between 1,500 and 1,800 died. About 500. 700 survived, many with severe injuries. It was the worst maritime disaster in American history, more than the Titanic. More than any other U.S. ship disaster, the bodies kept washing up for weeks. Some were found as far as 100 miles downstream. Many were never recovered, lost to the river forever. The survivors were treated in Memphis hospitals. Many had burns, injuries from the explosion, or near-drowning trauma. Some had spent hours in the cold water before being rescued, All were traumatized by watching their fellow soldiers die after they had survived so much already. News of the disaster spread quickly, but the public response was muted. Why? Because of timing. The Sultana exploded on April 27, 1865. Just 12 days earlier, President Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated on April 15th. The nation was in mourning. Newspapers were filled with coverage of Lincoln's death, his funeral train's journey across the country, and the manhunt for his assassin, John Wilkes Booth. Booth was killed by Union soldiers on April 26th, the day before the Sultana exploded. The Sultana disaster was announced in newspapers on April 27th and 28th, but it was buried on inside pages, overshadowed by the continuing Lincoln assassination coverage. The Civil War had just ended. Lincoln was dead. The nation was exhausted, traumatized, and focused on the enormous task of reconstruction. Another tragedy, even one that killed 1,800 people, couldn't compete for attention. As a result, the Sultana disaster never became part of the national consciousness the way it should have. It was forgotten almost as soon as it happened. The investigation began immediately. Military officials and civilians wanted to know how this had happened. The findings were damning. Captain J. Cass Mason, who had made the deal to overload the boat, died in the explosion. He couldn't be held accountable, but the corruption was clear. The bribery arrangement between Mason and Captain Reuben Hatch was documented and investigated. Hatch was court-martialed again for his role in the disaster for accepting bribes and allowing dangerous overcrowding. But he was acquitted due to lack of direct evidence and destroyed records. He faced no real punishment for his role in killing 1,800 men. The boiler manufacturer and the mechanic who did the inadequate patch repair were also investigated, but no criminal charges were filed. It was determined that the overcrowding and poor repair had caused the explosion. But in the chaos of the post-war period, accountability was hard to enforce. Regulations for steamboat safety were eventually strengthened, but it took more disasters before serious reforms were implemented. The Sultana disaster should have been a turning point for steamboat safety, but because it was forgotten so quickly, its lessons weren't fully learned. The soldiers who died on the Sultana were mostly from Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, and other Midwestern states. They were farm boys, factory workers, clerks, ordinary men who had volunteered or been drafted to save the Union. They had fought at Shiloh, Vicksburg, Atlanta. They had been captured and survived months in Confederate prison camps. They had endured everything the Civil War could throw at them, and they had survived. They were going home. Their families were waiting. Their futures were ahead of them. And then, because of greed and corruption, they died in an explosion and fire on an overloaded, poorly maintained steamboat. The cruelty of the timing is almost unbearable. The war was over. They had made it. They were days away from home. And they died, not in battle, but because a boat captain wanted to make more money and cut corners on safety. Many of the survivors carried guilt for the rest of their lives. Why did they survive when their friends died? Some had grabbed a piece of wreckage while others drowned nearby. Some had been strong swimmers while others weren't. The randomness of who lived and who died haunted them. Some survivors became advocates, trying to get recognition for the Sultana disaster and compensation for survivors and families. But in the post-war chaos, their efforts gained little traction. The government was focused on reconstruction. Veterans' benefits were limited, and the disaster remained largely forgotten. A few small memorials were eventually erected in Ohio, in Tennessee, in Arkansas. But there's no major national memorial, no famous monument, nothing comparable to what exists for other disasters. The Sultana has been forgotten by history in a way that seems impossibly cruel given the scale of the tragedy. Today, most Americans have never heard of the Sultana. If you ask people about the worst maritime disaster in American history, they might say the Titanic, which was British and killed about 1,500, or the USS Indianapolis, which killed about 900. Almost no one knows about the Sultana's 1,800 deaths. Why has it been forgotten? Several reasons. First, the timing. The Lincoln assassination overshadowed everything in April 1865. The disaster couldn't compete for attention. Second, the victims were common soldiers, not wealthy or famous passengers. The Titanic killed rich and famous people. The Sultana killed poor farm boys from Ohio. In 1865, America, the victims' lives didn't generate the same level of public interest. Third, no one was dramatically punished. There was no trial, no execution, no clear villain to blame. The story didn't have the narrative closure that makes events memorable. Fourth, it happened during the transition from war to peace. The nation wanted to move on, to forget the war and its tragedies. The Sultana was just another reminder of what everyone wanted to put behind them. And fifth, unlike the Titanic, there were no wealthy survivors writing memoirs and keeping the story alive. The Sultana survivors were poor, uneducated soldiers who went back to their farms and tried to rebuild their lives. They didn't have the platform or resources to keep the story in the public eye. In recent years, there's been a small revival of interest in the Sultana disaster. Historians have written books, documentaries have been made. Descendants of victims and survivors have formed organizations to preserve the memory. But it remains one of the great forgotten tragedies of American history. The wreck of the Sultana has never been definitively located. The Mississippi River has changed course many times since 1865. The boat sank and was buried in river mud, and over 150 years, the river's movement has likely buried it even deeper or scattered the remains. Multiple searches have been conducted, with some claiming to have found portions of the wreck, but nothing has been conclusively proven. The site where the disaster occurred is now farmland in Arkansas. The river has moved that much. There's a small historical marker, but you'd drive past without noticing if you didn't know to look for it. The Sultana disaster teaches us several painful lessons. 1. Greed kills. Captain Mason and Captain Hatch put profit over safety, and 1,800 people died for it. 2. Corruption has consequences. The bribery that led to overcrowding directly caused deaths. 3. Cutting corners on safety is deadly. The patch job on the boiler instead of proper repairs was a fatal decision. 4. Timing matters in history. A disaster can be forgotten simply because it happened at the wrong time. 5. The victims of tragedy aren't always remembered equally. Poor soldiers don't get the same memorials as wealthy passengers. The men who died on the Sultana deserved better. They deserved a boat that wasn't overloaded. They deserved boilers that were properly repaired. They deserved captains who valued their lives over profits. They deserved to make it home to their families. And they deserved to be remembered. The Sultana disaster killed more people than the Titanic. It killed more people than any other maritime disaster in American history. Yet it's been almost completely forgotten, a footnote in Civil War history, mentioned briefly, if at all, in textbooks. But those 1,800 men were real. They had names, families, stories. They had survived a brutal war. They were going home. And they died because of greed and negligence. Their story deserves to be told. Their memory deserves to be honored. And the lessons of the Sultana disaster about safety, about corruption, about the value of human life deserve to be learned. On April 27th, 1865, the steamboat Sultana exploded and sank in the Mississippi River. Approximately 1,800 people died, more than on the Titanic, more than in any other American maritime disaster. History forgot them, but we can remember them now. Rest in peace to the 1,800 victims of the Sultana disaster. You survived the Civil War. You survived Confederate prison camps. You were going home. You deserved to make it, and you deserve to be remembered.